The moment had been perfect, or so I thought. I had spent the whole afternoon preparing a lovely dinner, setting the table with our best plates and lighting tall, elegant candles. Tonight we were hosting my husband Daniel's colleagues, a small team he worked closely with, and it was my way of supporting him in his career. I wanted him to feel proud, wanted his colleagues to see him as someone who had it all together, who had a wife who adored him. It was supposed to be a light-hearted evening with laughter and a few glasses of wine, but it didn't take long for me to realize that something was off. It started subtly, just an unusual glance or maybe even a shift in my perception. Her name was Amanda. She was tall, with a confidence that seemed to radiate effortlessly. Her laughter, clear and vibrant, often punctuated the conversation. Daniel had mentioned her in passing a few times, always describing her as sharp, ambitious, with a casual admiration that I now recognized as tinged with something else. As she sat across from us, I couldn't ignore how often her gaze would linger just a second too long on Daniel, how her fingers rested on her wine glass in a way that seemed suggestive. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, it wasn't unusual for coworkers to be friendly. But as the evening wore on, Amanda's behavior grew more noticeable. She made direct eye contact with him while laughing at his stories, brushed her fingers through her hair whenever he spoke, and leaned forward in a way that brought her closer into his line of sight. I found myself tightening my grip on my own wine glass, an uneasy sensation twisting in my stomach. Then, as if to add fuel to my rising suspicions, Amanda raised her glass and proposed a toast. "To Daniel," she said, her voice dripping with something that bordered on admiration, "for being such a guiding light for all of us. You're more than just a boss, you're a true inspiration." She smiled at him in a way that was far too intimate for my comfort. Her gaze lingered and he smiled back, a slight, knowing smile that seemed to acknowledge something shared between them. My heart hammered and for a second I had to look away, swallowing hard to hide the turmoil building inside me. It was like watching a slow-motion disaster. The rest of the evening continued with what appeared to be a game only they understood, with glances exchanged like quiet secrets, and their laughter blending into the background. I was on the outside looking in, my mind spiraling into questions and doubt. Then came the moment that changed everything. I was clearing plates from the table, trying to stay composed, when I overheard Amanda whisper to Daniel, "Are you coming to the conference next month? It'd be so nice if you did. We could, spend a little time outside of work." The tone, the way her voice dipped, made my blood run cold. I expected Daniel to shrug it off, to draw a line, to make it clear that their connection was purely professional. But he hesitated, his answer low and almost too quiet for me to catch. "Yeah," he murmured, "I'll be there." And in that second, everything clicked. My hands froze, the plate balanced precariously between my fingers as a wave of anger and humiliation crashed over me. It wasn't just a harmless flirtation. This was something more. As soon as they moved to the living room, I took a deep breath, barely managing to steady myself. I walked over, joining the group, feeling my presence jolt them out of their comfortable little bubble. I kept my eyes on Amanda, determined to make her understand that I saw right through her facade. I asked her with a smile that barely concealed my contempt, "So Amanda, tell me more about this conference. You seem excited about it." She gave a small, surprised laugh, glancing briefly at Daniel before responding, "Oh, it's just one of those long business events. Great for networking. But there was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes, a hint that my directness had caught her off guard. "Interesting," I replied, not letting go of her gaze. "Daniel hasn't mentioned much about it. I didn't realize it would be so personal for you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Amanda's smile wavered, and I could see Daniel shifting uncomfortably beside her. Silence lingered, thick with tension. It was like the unspoken understanding had finally been brought into the open. I could see Amanda trying to recover, but her confidence faltered. I'd exposed her game, called out the unspoken attraction between them, and it was clear that neither of them expected it. With the evening winding down, I could barely maintain my composure. As I walked them to the door, Amanda avoided my eyes, her usual charm replaced by a stiffness that hadn't been there before. After she and the others left, the house fell into an oppressive silence. Daniel closed the door, turning to face me, a hint of guilt etched across his face. "That was unexpected." he began, his voice uncertain. I didn't let him finish. Do you think I didn't notice, Daniel? My voice trembled with the weight of betrayal. Do you think I'm blind? He took a step toward me, his expression changing from guilt to something defensive. Look, it's not what you think, he said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. Oh, really? I shot back, crossing my arms, daring him to keep lying. Then tell me, Daniel, what exactly was going on between you two? Because from where I was sitting, it looked like she was more than just your colleague. His silence was all the confirmation I needed. The truth sat heavy between us, and I could feel the bond we once shared cracking, splintering under the weight of our unspoken truths. He opened his mouth to say something, but I cut him off. You don't need to explain. I think I've heard enough. And with that, I turned away, walking up the stairs to the bedroom, leaving him standing alone in the silence of the empty dining room, under the cold, flickering light of the candles that had long lost their warmth. In the solitude of our bedroom, I closed the door, leaning against it as I took a few breaths, trying to process everything I had just witnessed. My heart felt heavy, as if weighed down by all the unasked questions, the doubts that had been growing quietly, insidiously. My mind raced with flashes of Amanda's lingering looks, Daniel's hesitant smiles, and the way they had seemed to orbit around each other tonight, bound by some invisible thread I had only now started to see. I could hear Daniel moving around downstairs, the clinking of glasses as he cleaned up the remnants of what was supposed to be a perfect evening. It felt absurd to even think that only hours ago, I'd been excited to have his colleagues over, to support his career, to play the role of the perfect wife. But now, as I sat on the edge of our bed, it felt as though that version of my life had shattered, leaving me alone to pick up the pieces. When I heard his footsteps approaching the stairs, my pulse quickened, my hands curling into fists on my lap. He'd come up here, no doubt, to explain, to offer excuses I already knew I'd have no patience for. As he stepped into the room, I didn't even look at him. I kept my gaze fixed on the far wall, on the framed pictures of our last vacation, snapshots of our laughter that now felt hollow, false. Emma, he began, his voice soft, hesitant, as though trying to gauge my mood. I felt his presence beside me, the weight of him sitting down on the bed, but I didn't turn. I could feel my own anger bubbling up, threatening to erupt, but I stayed silent, unwilling to let him off the hook so easily. The weight of his betrayal was pressing down on me, making me feel small, almost fragile. Yet at the same time it lit a fire inside me that demanded answers, demanded he admit to what I'd just seen. Is there anything you'd like to tell me? I finally said, my voice tight, barely holding back the wave of hurt. I could feel him tense beside me, and for a moment, I wondered if he would tell me the truth, if he would let down the walls and be honest for once. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd seen 1,000 times before. It's complicated, he began, and the words sent a fresh stab of pain through me. I turned to look at him, meeting his eyes, searching for something. Remorse, perhaps, or regret. But what I saw was guilt, yes, but also a hint of something else. Flicker of shame, maybe. Or was it denial? What's complicated about it? I shot back, my voice sharp. Do you think I didn't see how she looked at you tonight? Or how you looked back at her? I'm not blind, Daniel. I can see when someone's trying to get close to you. My voice cracked at the last words, and I bit my lip, hating the vulnerability that crept into my tone. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked away as though gathering his thoughts. Amanda and I, we work closely together. There's nothing beyond that. You're reading too much into it. But his words fell flat, hollow, and we both knew it. I felt my chest tighten with frustration, my hands clenching into fists on my lap. I had seen the way she looked at him tonight, the way she'd almost dared me to confront her. She hadn't been shy. She wanted me to know, wanted me to see that I was the outsider now, that the intimacy she shared with him was something I could never fully understand. I'm reading too much into it? I repeated, my voice rising, disbelief coloring every word. Daniel, she practically told you in front of me that she wanted you to spend time alone with her at the conference. Do you even realize how humiliating that was for me? How blatantly disrespectful that was. The tears I'd been holding back slipped down my cheeks, and I brushed them away quickly, refusing to let him see just how broken I felt. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the anger flaring up once more. Emma, please, he murmured, but the tenderness in his voice only made it worse. I didn't want his pity, didn't want his empty reassurances. I wanted the truth, the raw, ugly truth of what was really going on between him and Amanda. Just tell me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Have you done anything with her? Is there something going on that I don't know about? His eyes widened, surprise flickering across his face, as though he hadn't expected me to be so direct. No, he said quickly, shaking his head. There's nothing like that. I would never. I mean, I haven't crossed any lines with her. She's just a colleague. Nothing more. But even as he spoke, I sensed the hesitation, the careful way he chose his words, and it only deepened the gnawing doubt in my heart. He might not have crossed any physical lines, but the emotional boundaries, those had been blurred, broken, and that betrayal hurt just as much, if not more. I'd seen the way he looked at her tonight, the silent understanding they shared, the way they seemed to connect in a way I hadn't experienced with him in months, maybe even years. And what about us, Daniel? I asked, feeling the words slipping out before I could stop them. When was the last time you looked at me the way you looked at her tonight? When was the last time you laughed with me like that, made me feel like I was the only one in the room? The ache in my voice was raw, and I hated that I'd let him see just how deeply he'd hurt me. He looked away, his jaw tightening. Emma, don't do this. You know I love you. But the words sounded empty, like a promise long broken. I shook my head, feeling a bitter laugh escape my lips. Do I? I asked, my voice trembling. Because tonight it felt like I was the stranger. It felt like I was the one intruding on something that used to be ours. And that scares me, Daniel. It scares me that I don't recognize us anymore. For a long moment we sat in silence, the weight of everything unspoken filling the room, suffocating us both. I wanted him to say something, to reach out and bridge the gap that had formed between us, to tell me he'd fight for us, for our marriage. But he just sat there, his face unreadable, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. Finally, I stood up, feeling the need to escape the oppressive tension that had settled over us. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight, I said quietly, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes, but he didn't argue, didn't try to stop me. And that, more than anything, was what hurt the most. As I lay alone in the cold, unfamiliar bed, I felt the first pangs of despair settle deep within me. The painful realization that perhaps this wasn't just a rough patch, that maybe there were cracks in our marriage that couldn't be mended. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, but all I could see was the image of Amanda's smile, the way Daniel's eyes had softened when he looked at her. And as I lay there, the tears slipping down my cheeks, I knew that no matter how hard I tried, things would never be the same between us again. The days that followed that dinner felt like walking through a fog. Everything was muted, heavy, as if the house itself had taken on the weight of the betrayal I felt. Daniel and I barely spoke. We moved around each other as if we were ghosts, haunting the same space yet worlds apart. He spent more hours at the office, coming home late with the excuse of new projects, deadlines, extra meetings. And every time he left, a small part of me wondered if he was with her. I tried to keep myself occupied, hoping that routine would soothe the ache. I'd pick up my phone to call a friend, but each time I put it down, not ready to share my pain, not willing to explain the confusion and heartbreak churning inside me. Instead, I found myself drawn to the memories of our life together. The old photo albums on the bookshelf, the silly souvenirs we'd collected on vacations, the small mementos scattered throughout the house. I tried to remind myself of all the reasons I'd fallen in love with him, of all the good memories we'd shared, but each happy memory felt tainted now, overshadowed by the suspicion that had burrowed into my heart. One evening, after yet another late night where he came home smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know, one way or another, if my suspicions were real or if my mind was playing cruel tricks on me. And so, in a fit of desperation, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went to his office. I arrived unannounced, telling myself it was just to bring him the lunch he'd forgotten, a peace offering of sorts. But in truth, I wanted to see for myself what was really going on. I took the elevator up to his floor, my heart racing as I clutched the lunch bag in my hands, trying to calm the anxious tremor in my fingers. When the doors opened, I stepped out, glancing around at the sleek, modern office, trying to remember where his team's section was located. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed several people look up, eyes widening in surprise as they saw me. It was clear I wasn't expected, and for a moment I felt a surge of embarrassment, questioning if I was crossing a line. But the doubt evaporated when I spotted her. Amanda, standing by the coffee machine, laughing at something on her phone. She looked up as I approached, her expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. "Oh, Emma," she said, feigning warmth. "What a surprise. Are you here to see Daniel?" I forced a smile, struggling to keep my composure. "Yes, I just thought I'd bring him lunch," I said, holding up the bag. "Is he around?" Amanda's smile widened, but there was something in her eyes, something almost triumphant. "Oh, he just left for a meeting," she said smoothly. "You must have missed him by only a few minutes." I nodded, trying to hide the disappointment I felt, the sting of suspicion sharpening once more. "That's too bad. I just wanted to surprise him." She tilted her head, studying me with a look I couldn't quite read. "You know, Daniel's lucky to have someone who cares so much," she said, her voice dripping with something that felt too close to pity. "It must be hard being married to someone who's so busy all the time." The comment, subtle as it was, cut through me, and I felt my smile falter. I realized then that Amanda wasn't just a colleague who happened to get too close to my husband. She was someone who saw herself as an equal, as someone who deserved his attention, perhaps even more than I did. "Busy, yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we manage. We've been together for years, after all. I suppose we understand each other better than anyone." Her smile didn't waver, but I saw a flicker of something. A challenge, maybe? "Well, of course. Marriage is all about compromise," she said lightly. "It must be nice to have someone waiting at home." I felt my heart twist, the implication sinking in like a cold blade. She wasn't hiding her intentions anymore. She wanted me to know that she was close to him, that she had a place in his life that was growing, inching closer to what I had always believed was mine alone. I couldn't take it any longer. "Yes," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "It is nice. But I hope you don't misunderstand his kindness for something else. Daniel and I, we have a strong bond. No amount of late-night work will change that." Amanda's eyes narrowed just slightly, her smile frozen, but the expression in her eyes hardened. "I would never presume to come between you two," she said, but the words rang hollow, the smugness in her tone unmistakable. I turned away then, needing to get out of that office, to breathe, to think clearly. I left the lunch on Daniel's desk and practically fled down the hallway, feeling Amanda's gaze following me as I went. As I stepped outside, the brisk air hit my face, and I felt a surge of anger and hurt that took my breath away. She was playing a game, trying to push me out of the picture, to replace me with herself. And worst of all, I had no idea if Daniel even realized it. Or worse, if he was letting it happen. When Daniel came home that night, I confronted him again, but this time I was prepared to go to war. "Daniel," I said, watching his face closely, "do you know what your little friend Amanda said to me today?" He looked up confused. "Amanda? You saw her?" "Yes," I said, unable to keep the anger from my voice. "I went to bring you lunch, and she made it abundantly clear that she sees herself as more than just your colleague. She practically told me I was in the way, Daniel." His eyes widened, but he didn't respond, and the silence was answer enough. The guilt in his face, the way he couldn't meet my eyes, spoke volumes. I realized in that moment that he had allowed this, that he had let her get close, let her believe she had a place in his life that was meant for me. "Emma, it's not like that," he finally stammered. We're friends. Nothing's happened." I shook my head, feeling my heart shatter once more. Friends don't look at each other the way she looks at you. Friends don't make your wife feel like an outsider in her own marriage. The desperation in my voice must have reached him, because he stepped closer, his face softening, regret flashing in his eyes. "Emma, please. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted you to feel this way." "Then why didn't you stop it?" I whispered, the question hanging between us, heavy with the weight of betrayal. He didn't answer, and that silence was the final blow. It was then that I understood that something precious had been lost between us, that the trust one had placed in him had been fractured, perhaps beyond repair. In the days that followed, we lived in an uneasy truce, avoiding the subject, pretending everything was normal. But the distance between us was undeniable, an invisible wall that neither of us could breach. And each day, I felt myself slipping further away from him. The love I had once felt replaced by a quiet, simmering resentment. I didn't know what the future held for us, whether we would find a way to rebuild what had been broken, or if this was the beginning of the end. But one thing was certain. I was no longer the same person who had stood by his side, trusting him implicitly. I had learned painfully that sometimes even the strongest bonds could be tested, that even love could be eroded by doubt and betrayal. And as I lay awake at night, alone in the darkness, I wondered if I would ever be able to forgive him, or if I was simply waiting for the courage to walk away. Days turned into weeks, and the hollow ache that had settled in my chest only grew. Every time Daniel walked through the door, I would watch him carefully, looking for signs. Anything that might tell me what he was really feeling, what he was hiding behind those tired eyes and half-hearted smiles. But he seemed to slip into a routine of practiced normalcy, as if hoping that by maintaining the familiar rhythm of our lives, we could pretend that nothing was wrong. I, however, couldn't pretend. Amanda's words haunted me. Her voice, that smug smile, and the certainty with which she had looked at me, as though she'd already won some invisible contest. The memory replayed itself in my mind at the most unexpected moments. When I was preparing dinner, folding laundry, trying to fall asleep at night. It was like a wound that refused to heal, and I found myself growing resentful, angry not only at Amanda but at Daniel, for letting it come to this. Then one Friday evening, I came home from running errands to find Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, deep in thought. He hadn't heard me come in, and as I watched him from the doorway, I realized how weary he looked, how tense. His face was drawn, his hands clasped together as he stared at nothing in particular. For a brief, painful moment, I felt a surge of pity for him, but just as quickly it was replaced by anger. This was his mess. He had let Amanda into our lives, into our marriage. I cleared my throat and he looked up, startled. "Emma," he said, as though seeing me for the first time in days. He offered a weak smile, and for once, he seemed to drop the mask he'd been wearing. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer, but I sat down across from him, folding my arms as I waited, refusing to make this easy for him. He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the table, and I could see the struggle in his face, as if he was trying to find the right words, to summon the courage to say what needed to be said. Finally he spoke, his voice low and halting. I've been thinking a lot, Emma. About everything. About us, about what happened with Amanda." I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. "So you admit it, then? That there was something between you two?" He swallowed, and I saw the flicker of guilt flash across his face. "No, I mean, not exactly. Nothing happened between us, Emma, I swear. But," he sighed, looking away, and in that moment I realized how deeply conflicted he was, how torn. I let things go too far. I knew she had feelings, or at least I sensed something was there. But I didn't do anything to stop it. A cold wave of anger washed over me, mingling with a sadness so deep it felt as though it might swallow me whole. Why, Daniel? Why would you let her think she had a chance? Why would you let her come between us? He rubbed his face, clearly struggling. "I don't know," he murmured, his voice laced with regret. "I guess I enjoyed the attention. Things between us haven't been the same for a while, Emma. I don't know how we drifted so far apart. But somewhere along the line I started feeling like something was missing." His words stung, but in a way they confirmed what I had feared. We had both felt it, the distance, the quiet erosion of intimacy. But while I had clung to our marriage, desperate to preserve what we had, he had allowed someone else to fill that gap, to slip into the cracks of our relationship. I felt a mix of sadness and anger, a bitter sense of betrayal that went beyond his actions and seeped into the very core of who we were as a couple. "So you're blaming me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You're saying this is my fault?" No, he said quickly, his eyes widening. "That's not what I'm saying. This is on me, Emma. I should have come to you, I should have talked to you instead of letting myself get caught up in whatever that was with Amanda. I was weak and I let myself get distracted. But that doesn't mean I don't love you. I do. I want us to fix this." The sincerity in his voice was real, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. But it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. How could I trust him again? How could I ever be sure that he wouldn't let someone else slip into our lives? That he wouldn't be tempted to seek out that missing something elsewhere? I don't know if I can just move on from this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can pretend that everything's fine, that I don't feel betrayed. He reached across the table, taking my hands in his, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. Emma, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. I'll talk to Amanda, I'll set boundaries. I'll make it clear that there's no place for her in our lives. I'll go to counseling, I'll do anything. Just please give me a chance to make this right. I looked into his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had once promised to be by my side no matter what, the man who had made me feel safe and loved. And for a brief, painful moment I wanted to believe him, to believe that we could find a way back to each other. But there was a part of me that remained guarded, that refused to let down my defenses so easily. I had seen the way he looked at Amanda, the way he had let her into his life, and that memory was burned into my mind, a scar that wouldn't heal overnight. I don't know, Daniel, I said, pulling my hands away, feeling the walls closing in around me. I don't know if I can just go back to the way things were. I need time. I need to think about what I really want. He nodded, his expression somber, but there was a flicker of determination in his eyes. Take all the time you need, Emma. I'll wait. I'll prove to you that I'm worth it. Over the following weeks, Daniel kept his word. He told Amanda they needed to keep things strictly professional, that he was committed to repairing his marriage, to rebuilding the trust he had broken. He started coming home earlier, making an effort to be present, to reconnect with me. He suggested we go to counseling, and though I was reluctant at first, I eventually agreed, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it could help us find a way back to each other. But as the days passed, I realized that healing wasn't a simple process. There were moments when I felt a spark of hope, when I believed that we could overcome this, that we could rebuild our relationship stronger than before. But there were also days when the pain resurfaced, when the memory of Amanda's smug smile and Daniel's hesitant glances would haunt me, dragging me back into that dark place of doubt and mistrust. One evening, as we sat on the couch together, a tentative silence hanging between us, he took my hand, his grip gentle, warm. Emma, I know this isn't easy, he said softly. I know I have to earn your trust back, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. But I need to know that you're willing to try, that you believe in us at least a little. I looked at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time, I allowed myself to let go of a fraction of the anger I had been holding on to accept that maybe he was truly sorry, that maybe he had learned from his mistakes. I squeezed his hand, a small tentative gesture of forgiveness. I want to believe in us, Daniel, I said quietly. But you have to understand it's going to take time. I can't just forget what happened overnight. He nodded, his face softening with relief. I understand. I'll wait as long as it takes. As the weeks turned into months, we continued working on our marriage, slowly, carefully, rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. There were setbacks, moments when old wounds reopened, when doubts crept in. But each time we found a way to move forward, to communicate openly, to be honest with each other in a way we hadn't been in years. It wasn't easy, and I knew it would never be the same as it once was. But as I looked at Daniel one evening, seeing the love in his eyes, the quiet determination, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could build something new. A relationship that was stronger, more resilient, shaped by the scars we had endured together. And in that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps we had both found our way back to each other, not as the people we once were, but as two souls who had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. As time passed, I began to settle into this new version of our marriage, a relationship rebuilt from the remnants of trust and love that had once come so easily. Every step was cautious, deliberate, as though we were learning to walk together all over again, unsure if the ground beneath us was solid enough to hold the weight of our past. Daniel became more attentive, more present in ways I hadn't realized I'd missed. He started leaving small notes around the house, apologies mingled with memories, reminders of the love that had once felt so steady. Some mornings I'd find a note tucked into my coffee mug. I'm grateful for you. Or perhaps pinned to the bathroom mirror. Thank you for giving us another chance. These gestures were small, almost too simple to rebuild the bridge between us, but each one seemed to soften the anger I'd carried brick by brick. Yet, even as we worked to find our footing, there were moments when shadows of doubt lingered, flickering like ghosts at the edges of my mind. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and find him beside me, his breathing steady, his arm draped over me protectively. And still a small voice would whisper, "Will this last? Is this real?" The hardest part was learning to let go of Amanda's shadow. Every time I thought I'd moved past it, I would catch myself slipping back into that familiar ache of distrust. It was worse on days when Daniel had to work late, his calls and emails coming in with a frequency that reminded me too much of those days before the dinner, before I knew her name. One Friday evening I decided to surprise him at work. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety as I walked into his building, past the polished floors and gleaming lights that had once seemed so welcoming. I told myself I just wanted to bring him dinner, to remind him of our commitment to each other. But in truth, part of me needed to see for myself, to be sure there was nothing left lingering between them. I took the elevator up to his floor, clutching the bag of takeout, hoping that tonight would be quiet, that I wouldn't see her there. But as the elevator doors opened, I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. Amanda was standing in the hallway, speaking quietly with one of the other team members, her expression soft and relaxed, as if she hadn't a care in the world. For a second I froze, my mind racing as I took in her appearance. She looked confident, almost serene, and it struck me how much I'd built her up in my mind as this looming threat. Part of me had expected her to be gone, to have disappeared from Daniel's world entirely, yet here she was, casually chatting as if nothing had happened. She glanced up, noticing me, and a flicker of surprise crossed her face before she offered a tight smile. "Emma," she said, her voice polite, controlled. "Here to see Daniel?" I forced a smile, steadying my voice. "Yes. Thought I'd bring him dinner." There was a pause, one that stretched uncomfortably, and in that moment I felt a strange clarity. Amanda was no longer the threat I had built her up to be. She wasn't the same confident figure from that dinner night, the woman who had made me question everything. Now, standing in front of her, I saw her for who she was, a colleague, someone who had gotten too close, but ultimately just another person in Daniel's orbit. She no longer held the power to shake my world, to undermine the foundation of my marriage. I brushed past her, heading toward Daniel's office, feeling her gaze on my back. When I reached his door, I knocked softly and he looked up, surprise lighting his face as he saw me. "Emma," he said, standing up, his expression shifting from surprise to warmth. "What are you doing here?" I held up the takeout bag, a small smile breaking across my face. "Thought I'd bring you some dinner. Thought we could eat together, if you're not too busy." He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reminded me of the man I had first fallen in love with. "Not too busy for you," he said, moving around the desk to take the bag from my hands. His touch lingered on my arm, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling of reassurance, of home. As we sat together, sharing the meal in the quiet of his office, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I realized that while the memories of Amanda's intrusion into our lives would never fully disappear, they no longer held the power to consume me. I could feel the resentment slowly giving way to something else. A cautious acceptance, a realization that this chapter in our lives was a test we had survived together. When we finished eating, Daniel took my hand, his gaze steady, his voice low. "Emma, I know I've said it before, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the hurt I caused you, for making you feel like you couldn't trust me." He looked away briefly, his jaw tightening. "It was selfish of me, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I promise I won't ever make you question my loyalty again." I squeezed his hand, feeling a surge of emotion. "I'm trying, Daniel," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm trying to let go of everything, to move forward. But it's hard. There are days when I wonder if we'll ever be able to go back to how we were." He nodded, his expression solemn. "I know. And I don't expect you to forget overnight. But I'm here, Emma. I'm here for as long as it takes." In that moment, sitting in his office, surrounded by the remnants of our dinner, I felt a quiet sense of closure. I realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It meant accepting that our marriage had changed, that we had both changed. We weren't the same people we'd been before the hurt, but maybe that was okay. Maybe we could build something stronger, something more resilient because of what we had been through. As we left the office that night, walking side by side into the cool night air, I felt the weight of the past lifting bit by bit, replaced by a fragile but hopeful sense of possibility. We had a long road ahead of us, but for the first time in a long time, I felt as though we were facing it together, bound by a shared resolve to make it through one step at a time. And in that quiet moment I allowed myself to believe that we just might make it. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and I settled into a new rhythm. Our life together took on a cautious, almost tender quality, like we were rediscovering each other after years of letting familiarity blur the sharp, clear outlines of who we each were. We spent more time talking, not just the casual exchanges about the day-to-day, but real conversations, the kind we used to have late into the night when we were newly married, filled with dreams and promises. One evening while we were out on a walk, he reached for my hand, and I felt a warmth flood through me. A soft reassurance that maybe, just maybe, we were finally mending what had been broken. The air was cool, and a light breeze whispered through the trees, brushing the last of the autumn leaves across our path. We walked in silence for a while, the stillness of the evening making everything feel more intimate, more connected. "Emma," he said finally, his voice breaking the quiet in a way that felt both familiar and new. "I've been thinking about us, about how we got here." I looked up at him, sensing a seriousness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "I think about it too," I replied, my voice soft. "I wonder how we went from being inseparable to feeling like strangers in our own home." He nodded, and I could see the regret in his eyes. "I took you for granted," he admitted. "I got so caught up in everything, work, expectations, this idea that I had to be more, do more. And somewhere in all of that, I lost sight of what mattered most." He paused, his fingers tightening around mine. "I lost sight of you." Hearing him say those words, I felt a wave of sadness and relief wash over me. It was painful to confront the truth of how far we had drifted, but it was also a relief to know that he was finally acknowledging it, that he was seeing the cracks in our relationship that I had tried so hard to ignore. "I think we both did in some ways," I said quietly. "I got so used to us being together, to our life as it was, that I didn't notice when things started to slip. I thought if I just ignored the little things, the distance, it would fix itself." He stopped walking, turning to face me. The streetlight cast a warm glow over us, and I saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine regret. "Emma, I don't want us to go back to the way things were," he said, his voice firm. "I want us to be better, to be stronger. I don't ever want you to feel like you're alone in this again." His words struck a chord deep within me, and for the first time, I felt the last remnants of the resentment I'd been holding on to start to fade. I reached up, placing my hand on his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips. "I want that too," I whispered. "But it's going to take time, Daniel. I'm still healing." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll wait as long as it takes. I'll keep proving to you every day that you're the only one I want, the only one I need." We continued our walk in silence, a new sense of understanding between us. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was the beginning of something that felt like it could be. I realized then that the future wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that the pain had never existed. It was about finding a way to carry that pain with us, to let it shape us into something stronger. In the months that followed, Daniel made good on his promise. He changed in ways I hadn't expected, becoming more attentive, more present, more invested in our relationship than he had been in years. He started taking more time off work, spending weekends with me, planning little trips and outings, just the two of us. He even suggested we go away for a weekend, something we hadn't done in a long time. We chose a small, quiet town by the coast, a place where the noise of the world faded into the sound of waves and the call of seagulls overhead. That weekend was a turning point for us. We walked along the shore, our feet sinking into the wet sand, our laughter mingling with the crash of the waves. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by a lightness, a joy that I thought I'd lost. We stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing, falling into bed with the ease and comfort that had once defined our marriage. It was as though we were rediscovering each other, peeling back the layers of hurt and resentment to find the love that had always been there, waiting beneath the surface. But healing wasn't a straight path. There were still moments when doubt crept in, when a sudden memory of Amanda or a stray thought would make my heart ache. And every time I felt that familiar pang of pain, I would look at Daniel, at the way he looked at me with that same mixture of love and regret, and I would remind myself that we were choosing to move forward together, that we were choosing each other day after day. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever fully get past this?" I asked, my voice soft, hesitant. He was silent for a moment. Then he placed a gentle kiss on my forehead. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I do know that I'm willing to try every day for as long as it takes. I don't care how long it takes. I just want to be with you however that looks." His words gave me a strange sense of comfort. There were no guarantees, no promises of a perfect future, but in that moment I realized that maybe that was okay. Maybe the strength of our relationship wasn't in its perfection, but in our willingness to face the imperfections together, to choose each other despite the flaws, the mistakes, the pain. And so we kept going step by step, day by day, learning to trust again, to open our hearts to each other with a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. There were still challenges, still moments when the weight of the past would resurface, but each time, we found a way to navigate it together, to let the love we had rebuilt guide us forward. Over time, our home began to feel like a place of warmth and safety again, a place where laughter filled the rooms, where quiet moments of shared understanding replaced the silence that had once filled the space between us. The scars of the past were still there, but they had softened, woven into the fabric of our life together, reminders of the journey we had taken to get here. And as I looked at Daniel, at the man who had once broken my heart and then worked so hard to mend it, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, for the love we had lost, for the love we had found, and for the resilience that had carried us through. I knew that we would never be the same as we once were, but maybe that was the beauty of it. We had emerged from the darkness, not as the people we had once been, but as something stronger, something deeper. In the end, our story was one of forgiveness and growth, of choosing each other over and over again, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. And as I held his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together, side by side, bound by a love that had been tested, but had never truly broken. The journey that had once felt insurmountable, filled with shadows and doubts, now felt like something we had overcome, something we had conquered together. And in the quiet of that realization, a peace settled over me, a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Daniel and I were not who we'd once been, but in that transformation I found a new strength, a new foundation that felt both fragile and unbreakable at once. One evening, several months after our weekend by the coast, we hosted a small gathering at home. A few close friends, laughter, and music filled the rooms that had once held so much pain and silence. As I moved around, serving drinks and exchanging stories, I glanced over at Daniel. He was standing by the fireplace, listening intently to a friend's story, his face lit by the soft glow of the lights we'd strung up. And then, in an unguarded moment, he looked over at me. Our eyes met, and I saw in his expression the reflection of everything we had been through. The love, the regret, the healing, and the commitment. It was a silent promise, one made without words but rooted in the depths of who we were. For the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not only for Daniel but for the journey we had taken to reach this place. When the night drew to a close and our friends had gone, we sat together in the dim light of the living room, the house quiet once more. Daniel wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close, and for a moment, I allowed myself to simply be, to breathe in the warmth of his presence, the familiarity that had taken on a new meaning. We didn't need to speak. Words were no longer necessary. We had said all that needed to be said, and the silence now was one of understanding, of forgiveness, of love. As I looked around our home, the pictures on the walls, the small memories we'd built over the years, the laughter that had returned to our lives, I felt a deep sense of contentment. Our story wasn't perfect, nor was it without pain, but it was ours. And in that imperfection I found something real, something unbreakable. That night, as I drifted to sleep in his arms, I knew that we had not only survived the darkest moments but had emerged stronger, bound by a love that had been tested and proven. And as I closed my eyes, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that whatever the future held, we would face it together, no longer haunted by the past but strengthened by it. This was our story. A story of love, of forgiveness, of finding each other again when it mattered most. And in that quiet, I knew that we had found something far more precious than we'd ever had before. A love that had been tested, and a promise that would endure.